So what we'd like to jump into now is just our take versus the industry. So what is the industry saying? And some of these things I just did searches for, Joel, in terms of terms and phrases, and I'm going to kind of present them out to you, and we just want to hear your opinion. Is this true? Is this not true? It's obviously what the industry thinks, so it's not always accurate, but there's people that have that mindset for some reason, right? Both on monolith and composable. So let's start diving into the monolithic solutions. So people say monolithic solutions are easier to develop, test, and deploy as they're unified and have a consistent environment. What's your kind of thought on that kind of positive for a monolithic
To
solution?
me, this statement says to me, change is hard. So we've always been building monolithic applications. And this is the way we've always done it. So we should keep doing it that way. We only have one thing to work on, and this works well if your monolithic application is small. And usually they start out that way. So if you're building a brand new thing, then usually you're fine to start off with the monolithic idea. And you know what, you can grow up to composable later. I don't think that's a good way to start with. This all goes out the window if you are, say you're like, hey, we're going to redo all of our websites in our company. We're going to purchase this big DXP to do that. You immediately are not in a situation where things are easier to develop, test, and employ. So to me, this statement is as false as they come with that. So it's interesting that it's out there, but it's because it's like this is why initially there was a lot of especially enterprise pushback to composable because people this is how we've always done it was the kind of a thing, which to me that's what this sentence says. I think the industry is starting to see that it's like this is just not true.
Right, right. Interesting. Okay, awesome. And then here's some, negatives that people have said about monolithic solutions. So they're harder to scale, they require more resources and infrastructure to handle increased load. So you kind of already talked about this. I don't know if there's anything else you want to add to this, but we already talked about scaling being a difficult thing for a monolith.
Yeah, and it's interesting that we're talking about technical stuff and not as much about like, hey, what do marketers think? Someone who's using it. But this is definitely from the just think about how much code you have to like push out to a server when you're deploying a change. It's just that much harder. And if I want to scale something up by splitting it across multiple servers or beefing up a bigger piece of compute on the cloud, it's just I have more code that I need to actually do that with. So it's harder. And it gets exponentially harder as my load increases and as I try to do more things with that monolithic app. If I try to add a piece onto it, it gets harder. I would say that the point one, the way this comes out for non-technical people is just it's like, yeah, it just seems like it just gets slower and slower all the time. It seems like when we first had it was fast when we first did it, but then it's really slow. And this is why, because it's harder to scale.
Yeah. Yeah, and a lot of companies solve this by just throwing more money at the infrastructure, but you're kind of not really solving the problem, right? So you're like, let's just scale up, scale up, scale up, scale up, and eventually that'll hit a tipping point where it just like dies. So we've definitely seen that. We work with a lot of high load sites, and obviously they can be built as they can be built incorrectly as a composable architecture, and you can have scalability issues too. But generally, the way you have to architect a composable solution is different in the sense that you have to think about these things as you build it versus a monolith. You just deploy it and you just say, oh, we'll just increase load. So I've seen people really, really increase their hosting costs and things with a monolith solution. And that's actually why they've come to us being like, we need to reduce this side of the business and not spend so much money there. And number two, harder to update. We kind of talked about this one a little bit too. As they change any part of the code base, it affects the whole system. So it's one big deployment. And so, one little update could affect something that you didn't want to touch at all.
Yeah, and this is something that sort of comes about and gets worse and worse as time goes on. And everyone, I think, in the DevOps sort of, if you've been part of a DevOps pipeline, then you all have your nightmare stories of like, oh my gosh, we thought it was a small thing and it was 2 p.m. and we deployed this thing and took down the whole infrastructure. Or like all those CPUs maxed out at 100 all across everywhere. So the problem with this is that not only is it harder to get it out there, it's harder to roll back. And you need to set up all this infrastructure to kind of do that. And there are lots of tools to do that now. There's even books that have been written about DevOps and about how this has evolved and gotten better and made it easier to deploy monolithic solutions. But I prefer to take that learning and apply that to the composable solutions, because a smaller piece is always simpler, no matter what it is. To me,
Right.
the monolith, it tends to get bigger than I can hold all in my head, and that's how you get these. A butterfly. We had this one piece of code that affected something else and did a regression issue that you don't know about. That's when you kind of get it to scary DevOps times.
Yeah, and one thing that I really push people to think about here is that I've seen people come from a monolithic solution, roll out a composable solution, but still think about it as a monolithic solution. So they're still doing, huge big deployments. They're still doing, 2-week iterations or monthly iterations. Like it's a mindset shift for people as well, not just the platform. When you go to composable, you need to architect your composable solution in a way that allows you to deploy these things out individually and do these different things so that you're not limiting the innovation and limiting the benefits of a composable solution. So don't build it in a way that you deploy everything. We've seen a lot of people build, Java, .NET, big, huge applications on top of
Mm-hmm.
composable architectures. And that application becomes a monolithic application on all of these composable backend solutions. So to deploy something is actually very difficult. And it doesn't help the DevOps. So coming from a monolithic solution to a composable solution isn't just about the platforms. It's also your mindset and how you build and how you
I was
roll
just
things
about to
out.
say, John, yeah, if all your experience is with monolith, then agile is bad, because agile is really hard with monolithic mindsets. So if you want to
Right.
be more
Right.
agile in your organization, whether that's technical organization or not, then monolithic sort of says you can't do that, and you can really actually what you're trying to describe, actually, John, is the composable monolith, which we've seen some folks build, even though they were trying to go
Yeah.
composable. It's a kind of a trap that it's easy to fall into.
Yeah, one of the benefits that I've seen, Netlify has been really pushing, obviously Jamstack and these solutions around Gatsby and Next.js and those type of things. The great thing there is those frameworks, those development frameworks, have a mindset of stateless, have a mindset of building solutions that are more composable, more easy to deploy. Kind of force you to kind of think that way. So we've seen a lot of people on our side move for more monolithic deployments, you should say, not just solutions, but the deployment itself from a monolithic deployment to more serverless, microservices, stateless, all these type of things. And that's just on the development side. Forget about the platform side. So, and I think that's how some monolithic solutions are trying to say they're composable, because they're kind of deploying in a composable kind of model where it's smaller deployments, but the backend is still a monolithic application, and vice versa. So it's kind of interesting how you build and deploy can actually make a monolithic a little bit more composable, and vice versa as well. So something to keep in mind and not get mixed up when you're looking at different solutions. Another one, again, related to kind of some of our initial points that we had, but this is all stuff that I just Googled for, and I was just trying to see, like, what are people saying out there? They're saying monolithic solutions are harder to debug. They have large, complex code bases that make it difficult to isolate and fix errors. So you kind of added
I
already
agree
to this.
100% with this one.
Yeah, yeah, and I've seen people trying to debug issues, but they just give up. They're just like, you know what? We're just going to find a workaround with a monolithic, and we learned to live with this, right? So it's
Yep.
just like, yeah. And the fourth one, they're harder to innovate with, as they have a rigid, tightly coupled architecture that limits the flexibility and the creativity of developers. And this phrase was specifically from developers, but I actually see it more when I'm talking to businesses, talking to the actual business users, the marketing teams, the content teams. They're the ones actually getting held back more.
Well, the business will say, we want to do this. We want to, go into these new industries, or we want to, have these kind of benefits. We want to bring new benefits to our users. And then the technical teams will say, yeah, that's going to introduce a lot of risk, and we're going to have to do a deployment and maybe go to the new version. And I don't know, maybe that's a 2025 problem, and we should just push that off because we've got these other things. And all of a sudden, everyone is just feeling tired.
Yeah, 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 and then they just give up. So I've seen a lot of teams being like, you know what, we can't do that, or it's not worth the effort. So this is the conversion of the better benefits we're going to get. This is the amount of effort. and they weigh those and be like, we can't do it. It's not worth it. So that's been a huge thing for marketers in terms of pushing and looking for more agile solutions and things more on the composable side. So let's look at the other side. So composable solutions, what's the industry saying? So people are saying composable architectures are more scalable. They can easily add and remove platforms based on their needs. They're more agile as they can update and deploy platforms independently and frequently without affecting the rest of the systems. I was kind of talking about this with the updates. You can update this or this part. What's your take on this? Do you agree with everything here? Is there anything you'd like to add or take away?
I think that, yeah, I agree with most of what these are saying. But it's really interesting how it's more easily to talk about these points from a non-technical perspective. So non-technical folks, I think, can actually participate more in the composable solution by saying, I don't like how our search works. Let's change the search. Can we just change how our search works? You know what? Why does my commerce, why does our website always go down on Black Friday? Can we just fix that? And then if you're in more of a composable solution, you can look at, okay, well, commerce, we've got a commerce platform. Let's swap out that platform to one that's, maybe can work better for what our needs are for like Black Friday or whatever. Right. So I really like the idea of, doesn't have to be a technologist's issue. This is something that non-tech people who want to just get the benefits of these systems, how they can actually participate more in the decisions around what platforms are going to be used.
Right. Well, so you agree with most of this. The next 4 points I have here are against composable. So I'm really excited to see what your take is on this in terms of your experience working with customers and building solutions over the years. So let's jump into the first kind of point against composable that I found. So they say, or people have said, they're harder to develop, test, and deploy as they require more coordination and integration between modules and teams. What's your take on that?
So yeah, this is one of the things that we've heard over and over again, is that you're going to have, it's going to be way more complex because you now have all these moving parts that are that could be that could change over time. And how can we make sure that the website, how can we make sure the website's not going to go down even if we change out our commerce platform or our search platform? And the fact of the matter is that they are harder to, I think they're harder to really, the hard thing is to envision it. The problem is that it's abstract, and you need to draw a picture for the people that you're convincing to move to composable. Sandeep had a great point. It's like, well, these APIs, what does that all mean? How do they connect together again? You've got a bunch of lines in your pictures, so it takes a little while to build up the trust that these platforms actually are stable. These services are actually, if you think of it, within a monolithic system, there's a bunch of invisible service things that you just can't see. Whereas with a composable system, you can see all the services. It's really easy to kind of tell which component is like the one that's the problem. So it actually is much easier to test it. It's just way more obvious when it doesn't work well, because you do need to coordinate and integrate these, the different platforms, and to make sure that the teams are working together. So what happens is, yes, you do need to do a little bit more work about coordination, which you should have been doing anyway, but the monolith told you, no, you don't need to. We can coordinate it all for you. We'll integrate your CMS and your personalization and all that stuff. Just take care of it. And so you never really thought about it. Whereas with a composable solution, you get to make these real decisions like, we're going to use this for CMS. We're going to use this for commerce. We're going to use this for search, personalization, metrics. Now you kind of build your own stack based on your needs. And that does take a little more sort of thought process. But almost always whether it's harder or not, I think that kind of goes away when you can roll it out way faster and show ROI much quicker.
Yeah, I think this ties into a lot of the other webinars we've been doing around content architecture and how you have to coordinate between teams anyway. People actually just don't do that in monolithic solutions, but they should be doing it anyway, because what happens is they roll out the solution and they give them all the team members, and then they all have to just go use that solution, but they're like, well, this actually doesn't do what I need it to do. Well, it's part of the system, so you have to use it. That's what you have. So maybe this does enforce a little bit more coordination between your teams, but I think that's good practice, and I think you get a better result and better conversion because of it. But the other part that it says here is that it kind of misses as well, is that you don't have to do all the systems at once. If you're doing a true composable solutions, you should be able to roll out each system independently, and they should be as stateless as possible, So really, you should be able to, just focus on a smaller subset that's more simple. That should be easier to develop, test, and deploy, and then you go to the next one, right? So if you come in with a monolithic mindset, you're going to try to look at everything like waterfall and do like that's difficult. So it's a mindset shift here, I think, and I think Sandeep's question is a perfect example of the first reaction of mind is, oh, I have to interop all these different systems and all the APIs, and they have to work together. It's like it feels very overwhelming if you look at everything at once, but you have to change your mindset to be more composable, which is look at one thing at a time, or maybe a couple at a time if they're really key systems that have to do a lot of communication or interoperability. But try to break them out so you look at one at a time. The next point that the industry is saying, they have lower performance. They can incur latencies and unreliability of network communication between modules. And I think what they mean by modules here would be like platforms or systems that do different components or different parts of your composable solution. What's your take on this one?
Yeah, I think that it does come back to, if you bring a monolithic mindset and sort of bad or non-modern, like old school development practices, this will totally be true. Like it's like you have a network, now you have APIs that go over a network channel, as opposed to in a monolith, everything is sort of in process. But with that being said, the fact that you can isolate the platforms to say what each platform is doing, and if you think about it, let's look at an actual use case. This is a really good one for this one. So let's think, okay, it's Black Friday. I've got 25 million people that are going to hit my website over that weekend, whereas on a normal day I only have a few thousand because I have a big special. I'm going to be selling tickets to Walt Disney World or something, right? Everyone's going to be buying those because I have a 10% off, right? So what do I need? I need my website to not go down. So even if they don't buy anything, they need to be able to like just browse everything. Well, I can do like static website development and things like that so that everyone can browse. Cool. So that doesn't even need my commerce thing. I'm not even hitting my commerce thing. Whereas in most monolithic systems, the commerce side goes down just with people browsing their sites on Black Friday, right? So so now I have choices about how I'm going to architect to solve problems. Whereas in a monolithic thing, I can't really adjust my architecture. I have to follow the rules of whatever that platform already gave me. And that's why, or hey, you got to go to the next version, which is really hard. I can't deploy it and blah, blah, blah. So because it's much easier on a composable system to deploy and test and sort of figure out what's going on, I can actually get way better performance, even though, I'm calling an API that may take 100 milliseconds for me to get my results back. But I can be a lot smarter about when I actually need to use that integration. And by the way, these things are made for being integrated. That's the whole point of them. And so there are lots of architecture examples of how to do this in a way that works. When the concept of service-oriented architectures came out back in like the early 2000s, most people said the same thing. Interestingly enough, we built agility starting back then based on that architecture, on that idea, and we've had the fastest CMS around forever because of that, because it's built with the idea that this is an untrue statement. It's like, don't worry about network latency. Just build a great service that's great at being integrated with stuff, and then let developers innovate so that marketers can get better rhythm.
And this comes back to the architecture and how you build things. Your mindset, if you're coming into composable world, if you're bringing the monolithic mindset forward and hard coding connections. We talked about this on what a true composable solution is a couple webinars ago. If you tie the systems together, so if one goes down, the other one goes down, you're building a composable monolith, right? So you have to look at, let's imagine that service doesn't exist. So I remember, Joel, we used to build websites in the 2000s that would bring Twitter feeds into the homepage of a website. And if a developer hard coded that call to Twitter, so that if Twitter went down, the website would error and it wouldn't load that homepage. I remember seeing that scenario where people would do that. And it was like, no, you have to build it assuming that service may not be available. So stateless. So like, whether the service is up or down, it doesn't affect the whole solution over here. Maybe it affects just that feed where it says, the feed's not currently available, but it has to be asynchronous and it has to have that disconnection. That is super important for these type of solutions where you build a composable solution. So if the e-commerce component, if you have to shut down the store, if you turn off the store, or you have to, do some other, the form submission for your market automation, maybe can't take any more leads or something. You have to be able to turn those things off and have the rest of the solution work properly, so you don't have that dependence. And that's proper architecture for a composable solution and a different mindset. But even for monoliths, they should always have that mindset too. So this is enforcing a mindset of better architecture.
Yeah, and the way that it's difficult with a monolith, John, is that new circumstances arise after I've rolled something out, right? So it's like, oh my gosh, we had no idea that on Black Friday people were going to use our website in this weird way, and so now we are at 9 a.m. on Black Friday. I need to make a fix, right? Monolithic solution, really, really hard to do that. And my DevOps team is going to be like, yeah, you got to live with it. We're just not going to get as many sales this today. When the traffic goes down, we'll see how things go. In the meantime, I can try to scale it up, but we probably won't, right? My blood pressure is already rising. But with a composable solution, and we've been in this solution. I've actually been in this exact scenario where it's Black Friday, 10 a.m., and we're seeing some weird things happen that we didn't expect. Okay, cool. Let's just adjust, one of these components. Boom, we push up the fix, and everything's good again. So that is an exact scenario that will happen. I'm not saying that we want things to go down, 10 a.m. on a Black Friday, but it allows you to be dynamic and agile as things change over time. Especially with you're usually doing like a 10-year decision about what platforms you work with. Composable platforms should be your next 10-year decision that you're making.
Right. The third thing they say, they have higher complexity as they introduce more dependencies and interactions between modules or platforms that need to be managed and monitored. So what's your thought on this one?
So there's two aspects of this. One is trust that comes with it. You talked about you got to have legality and agreements and stuff and SLAs now with multiple vendors, which is true. Yep. You need to establish that trust. Some organizations have difficulty establishing trust, especially when you have like an entrenched, especially if you're moving from a monolith and your IT department has just spent the last, X years keeping that monolith from crashing. Okay. So usually when we're working with organizations that have that mindset, then they will believe this. And they will try to make it true because, oh my gosh, we have all these different things with more complexity now, all these different APIs. I got to monitor all this stuff and I want to get, a Splunk data feed from each single one of them. And that can be true. And you could go ahead and do that. But it really does come down to trust. If I'm working with, Stripe, the Stripe API, I have to have an established kind of trust with that organization, with that framework that I'm using. And if they do something to break that trust, so maybe they don't like how some vendor does something, or they've moved away, or they do something in a way that I don't like, but I can swap it out. That's kind of the point of composable solutions. So there is a level of complexity with working with multiple vendors. That's just a fact of doing business these days. The idea of dependencies, I think you can sort of get around that with understanding it's like everything is a dependency. It was anyway. The monolith is just trying to hide that dependency because it says, hey, we give you one big package, but it still has all those pieces in that package that have dependencies and they have their own infrastructure that you just can't see it. Whereas in a composable solution, you can see it. You get to choose, oh, goodness, our form provider keeps going down because of whatever, or, they have a security problem with, some form thing where they're, it's like allowing people to harvest data or some goofy thing like that. So, hey, we're going to take that form provider out. We're going to put another form provider in because we lost trust with them and whatever. So I think that really there was always a higher complexity than you thought. Systems that try to hide that complexity are not doing you any favors. But if they can show you, hey, you know what? It actually, this component is basically making a complex problem simple. We're going to give you a simple API that does what it needs to do. That was the benefit of Stripe. How it really revolutionized the API industry for commerce, because it said, hey, we're going to take this really difficult problems of like doing a transaction, and we're going to solve that problem, make it a simple thing. And everyone said, oh, it's a terrible idea. And now they're like a multi-billion-dollar company doing it in, like 60 markets worldwide or more, different regions. So like, this is you can do one thing really, really well, much easier than you can do like 20 things really, really well. So the monolith just hides that complexity, and it's still there in the back end, which is why they keep getting slower over time.
Right. The one thing that hurts me when I read this is the word dependency. So a true composable solution, these different components aren't supposed to be too dependent on each other. They're supposed to be as stateless as possible. So just like what I said in the previous one, and number two, if one system goes down, it shouldn't take the other ones down, right? So that dependency is a weird word. What do you mean by dependency? Dependency for your overall solution to be rolled out, or dependency that if it goes down, it takes the other things down? Technically, it should be breaking down your solution into smaller chunks that are individually managed, individually kind of viewed, and can even be assigned out to different team members. So in a monolithic system, generally IT manages, or the technical team manages the whole thing. But if you're a user in the e-commerce side, or you're a user in the content side of the website, or you're a user over here, you have to take all of your complaints to the same single person who is that person who manages the whole thing, versus now you can actually have smaller teams managing each different component, which, if you look at the whole solution as one big solution, maybe it's more complex. There's more things, but you should never look at it that way. Look at it more granular, one thing at a time, and then it becomes more simple. So I think it's a viewpoint as well of just bringing what we've learned of the monolith to the composable world that gives this viewpoint that things should be dependent, and you should be looking at the whole solution and all the components at once. You really shouldn't be looking at it that way. These are separate things, and they can be more granularly kind of reviewed, managed, dealt with.
The word I like is black box. A monolith tends to create black boxes to hide the complexity, and which is great when you're like, yeah, it's too big for me to hold in my head, so it's good. It just says it'll do it, and I trust it. But it hides all that complexity, and then as soon as something changes, which over time things always change, then it's a black box. What's actually happening in the background? I don't even know, and I wish I knew. Whereas in a composable system, it's a little more complex in terms of all the different pieces, but you only need to zone in usually on one or two at a time, as you were saying, John. And it's a great question to ask. Well, what if the commerce goes down? Ask that question, and then you can test it on your UAT system and just see what'll happen. Make sure that the rest of the platform degrades gracefully.
Love it. Okay. And the last one, higher risk. We've only talked about security a little bit, but here they're saying more exposure to more points of failure and security vulnerabilities that need to be addressed. What's your take on that one?
Because we are basically, a composable solution is, first of all, it tends to be like simpler. Each component is simpler. Then by its very definition, they tend to be way more secure. Because I trust Stripe for all of my security if I'm using Stripe. I trust, maybe I'm using BigCommerce. You trust those APIs, and that's like a very defined stream where all of the transactions for credit cards and stuff are going through. That's kind of one thing where you can essentially establish trust, and then if somebody breaks the trust, you remove it. Talked about that a bit. But the other side of it is that it's like more modern development practices are in use on most composable solutions. Not always. You can still screw it up. But typically people are building like static or sites that use CDNs a lot better. And so what that's doing is it's getting a much less vector for attacks. So there's a lot of fewer places now where I can sort of attack a system, whereas a monolith tends to, with that whole black box, it tends to actually expose more things that I thought were handled. You talked about like Java and .NET. So if I have a big monolithic .NET solution, especially if it's older, it's harder for me to upgrade the version of .NET to just get all the platform things that are in there. And plus now my whole app is out there on the internet, right? Not just the small API endpoints that are towards the back end. So I've put the whole thing on the internet essentially. And so that whole thing is now exposed to potential attack. So if my monolithic app gets attacked and someone finds a way, sort of a backdoor in, they have my everything. They have everything that I have.
Exactly. Yeah. The severity of that security vulnerability on a monolith is way larger.
Yeah. So
right?
Whereas
they get access to
whereas if they just hack, I don't know, like say that, so there was I don't know, let's talk about my search. Okay. So like maybe that the search provider I was using, they found a way to hack that. And it's like, oh my gosh, someone searches for, products on my website. So they search for, Disney vacations, and something else comes back. Well, you can just take that component out or shut it off, or maybe do a small fix to do that, right? And so that only affected the one area because it was just that one thing. So if you do have an API that has a vulnerability, which tends to happen less and less because those components are updated way more often, right? Usually just the one version. But it's a much smaller attack vector for those things. So this is, again, patently untrue. This is, to me, a lot of these points that kind of go together to kind of help slow the industry down, and that worked until about 2022. What we started to see is starting last year, and in especially January this year, as people are just, everything is composable, because I think folks have started to see that these points aren't true. The monolith is dying.
Yeah, I love that one phrase you said there. You can just turn it off. So one of the great benefits is, like, let's say you do get hacked into one of the system for whatever reason, turn that system off, right? And then deal with that and leave everything else going, right? So you really can look at it in a smaller scope and kind of address
Well, and you
that.
can, you can also,
Okay,
sorry,
so
just to
let's,
stay on that point for a second, John, as an organization, you
yeah,
can also be really transparent. So if someone says, hey, you work for company X, and it comes out, it's like, hey, company X got hacked, you can actually be transparent. Yes, our search provider, there was a vulnerability found in our search provider. We turned off the search provider and either, swapped it with provider B, or waited until they fixed that vulnerability. And happens to be that in search, no one has any personal details. There's no credit card transactions or any of that sort of stuff. So you're all good. And now you can establish a level of trust with your users. Outside of, if I had a
right.
monolith, it's like you wouldn't know necessarily if everything, that, because search was right beside your commerce module, it's like in process with it on the same app. Then you hack the search, you also hack the commerce, and now you have all the credit card numbers of all your users and their passwords, and oops, everything's bad.
Right.